If there's been a rising chorus of lament over young people in the church, it's been over the rate at which young people are graduating from high school and leaving the church. For several years now, research projects have identified this post-high school exodus as a growing concern. But in their recently released book, David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock share research that helps us understand why those who stay decide to stay. What are the youth ministry practices that build resilient disciples of Jesus Christ? And what can we do to turn the tide on this discouraging trend? We talked to our friend Mark Matlock about the new book, Faith for Exiles, on this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
From the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, this is Youth Culture Matters. If you're a parent, youth worker, educator, counselor, grandparent, or anyone else who cares about kids, we're glad you've joined us for this practical, informative, and hope-filled podcast. This is a place where together we talk and think Christianly about the rapidly changing world of today's children, teens, and young adults.
Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Youth Culture Matters. I'm Walt Mueller here in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania, the universal headquarters of the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding, joined as always by my buddy Jason Soshnik. Well, not as always.
Well, not always.
As usual.
But often.
As sometimes.
But yeah, usual. That's a much better way of saying it.
Right. So
yeah, my wife always corrects me when I say always. She always says, well, is it always?
You know, and that is one of the rules in marriage. You never use the words always and never.
Yes.
Followed by
exactly
negatives
right.
and positives. Yes.
Although I'm still a newbie. I'm still learning.
I always use that principle. Never.
Yeah. I gotta. Oh man. So Jason, I'm really excited about today. My buddy Mark Matlock is joining us from Dallas, Texas. I'll save the football jokes till after the season, and I know that they're warranted. It's always dangerous as an Eagles
wait,
fan.
Are you saving the jokes because you're afraid that the Cowboys might actually have a better record than the Eagles?
That's how it could end up. It could end up.
Okay.
So, and you're lucky I haven't done any Bears jokes yet, because we could do that.
Go right after.
Right. Yeah. So Mark Matlock's joining us, and I got to say this is what I'm really excited about. Mark and David Kinnaman released a book. I had a chance to look at it actually before it came out. It's called Faith for Exiles, 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. It's published by Baker Books, one of our favorite publishers here at CPYU. And when I read this book, I mean, I'll say it this way. I felt my heart leaping, because what David and Mark have done is some research that's really pushed us towards understanding what some of our deep needs are in the world of youth ministry, in the church, and in our homes as well. And I love this book. So, Mark, I'm glad you're here to talk about it. Talk just a little bit about the project, the idea behind the project, and where you guys went to get your data. And then I want to start to unpack some of what you've learned and what your recommendations are.
Well, David and I started a friendship a little over 20 years ago. He actually went to Biola with my brothers, and we knew each other from there. And when I was working in my garage office, we were doing these student conferences, and we were kind of trying to figure out how to help teenagers better. And we realized there was not a lot of research on teenagers. And so I thought, well, let's do some. And so I naively called the Barna group and left a message and just said, hey, we're interested in sponsoring some research. I had no idea how much it cost. You know, it was just me in our garage running these conferences. And David called back, actually. He was working for George. He just finished at Biola and had been interning with him. And George basically said, hey, you can't afford me, but if you work with David, I'll make this reasonable for you guys to be able to do. So we did our first kind of nationwide study, David and I, on teens and evangelism. And it was really incredible for us as an organization because we were able to apply this research. But what it began in David and I, and David had an interest in this beforehand, was just really trying to understand the times and figure out what God should do. Basically, the sons of Issachar kind of thing. And that's always been David's passion, is trying to understand the times, try and figure out what the church should do. So, so David, I kind of been involved in the background a little bit on You Lost Me. Our original teens and evangelism research was used as a footnote in Unchristian that he wrote with Gabe Lyons. And this book was the third for David in what he would consider a trilogy. So there was Unchristian, looking at how the unchurched people were looking at Christianity. And then there was You Lost Me, which was really trying to understand the dropout problem better. Everybody was just reporting how many youth group attendees were no longer attending church. David wanted to drill down and understand, are there profiles of those people that are walking away? What do we really know about them? And I was involved in doing some analysis on that data and spoke into specifically chapter 2 of that book. And then this one, David and I were really wanting to find out, okay, we know that there are these students that are staying. We've been looking at the side of the profile curve that's walked away from the church or the faith. We want to look at those that are staying and what can we learn? And is there anything that's going on there that maybe the church could do more of than they presently are doing to better reach and prepare that side of the spectrum that's staying? So we looked at 18 to 29-year-olds who had identified at some point in time in their life that they were in fact a Christian. And we took a nationwide sample of students from that group. You know, Barna's probably conducted interviews with well over 10,000 millennials, Gen Zers over the last decade. The data was not only consistent with other trends that we'd seen in other research projects, but also there were some changes because we hadn't done some of this in like 7 years, some of the questions we asked. And we saw some changes in that. But we were really trying to understand the good news side. What's going right with those that are staying? So we also did look at those that walked away and found some things out, but we really found interesting insights about those that are staying and staying true to the faith.
Yeah, and we're going to come back and talk about that because I think it's brilliant what you guys have done. But there's a little summary here at the beginning of the book, which I want to read, and I want you to just give us a little insight into some terminology here. The last couple of words, it says this, a call-out box. Young non-Christians are avoiding Christianity. We know that, right? And young Christians are abandoning church. However, by cultivating 5 practices, we can form and be formed into disciples of Jesus who thrive as exiles in digital Babylon. Those last 2 words there, digital Babylon, this place where we live. Describe that terminology you use and what you're talking about there.
Yeah, that's something that that David's been kicking around for a while, and in our conversations we've been playing with, and we really wanted to lean into that. This idea that, you know, right now there's no question there's a generational tension, not just in the United States, but literally in countries all over the globe. In fact, we just completed a project at Barna on the connected generation, is what we're calling them. It was a global millennial study in 25 countries. And what we found was that those millennials in the church actually have more in common with each other than they do the older generations in their own countries, which is pretty remarkable. And this generational shift is really coming from a place for churchgoers, church-going boomers, particularly, and elders, that they kind of felt like America was Jerusalem, right? It was monotheistic. It was slower paced. It was homogenized. At least their experience of life was homogenized, right? America's always had some divides racially and things like that, but our experience, our lived experience, was much more homogenous. The people that we lived around were a lot more like us. There was a sense of central control, and kind of the idols in life were just self-righteousness and piety. And so that was kind of this idea that we're living in Jerusalem. And metaphors are fragile, so I don't want to read too much into all this. But this idea that now we've shifted, that we're now living in a Babylon of sorts, where it's pluralistic, it's not mono-religious, it's accelerated and frenetic. It's very diverse. I'm encountering people that are unlike me every day in the news media, even if it's not my neighbor. But even communities and geography is much more interspersed with people that are very diverse from us, and we're aware of that diversity in ways we may have been naive to in the past. And it's very complex and almost bittersweet. There's like this wonder about it, but there's also this tension and frustration that comes from it as well. And the idol of the day isn't self-righteousness as much as it is a fear of missing out. I want to be a part of everything. And so we've got a generation that's waking up anxious, and we go, why are you anxious? You're living in one of the most secure, prosperous times, but they're anxious because literally they wake up and they have maybe 1,000 options of how they could spend their day. And other generations didn't have that. Their life was much more simple and straightforward. So we're experiencing this shift in culture. And being a disciple in Babylon is very different than being a disciple in Jerusalem, where you have the support of the overwhelming community around you. And that's kind of what we were wanting to frame, is that there's this tension, but also just to help older generations even understand a little bit what they're experiencing in terms of stress and shock.
Wow. Something that stood out to me too in your study that you had mentioned in the book was that there was a social, you mentioned this social desirability status. It was a part of the survey, but that overall that could skew the study. That in past studies that there was a social desirability status, but that had all but evaporated. And so I'm just curious with regards to the study and how that happened, how that fits into this. I mean, was that surprising, or is that just expected as you were diving into the conversation and then asking these questions for this study?
Well, let's take, for example, pornography is a good example. There was a time, just maybe even 10 years ago, when if we would have asked questions about pornography on the phone or online, we would not have gotten accurate results. People would have been very careful about the things that they're saying. What we're seeing is people are not filtering what they're saying. They're giving us very honest responses. This idea of whether it's just a result of the internet age, but people are much more comfortable talking about things that we couldn't really get good, accurate survey information for years ago. And so it just leads us to believe that we're getting a real sense of what people are thinking. I mean, it was kind of funny. I remember, one of our stats was something like, pastors saying that they viewed pornography like 80%, some percent. And somebody goes, well, how do you know they're telling the truth? And I'm like, why would you lie about that? You know what I mean? Like, 80 some percent. I mean, so that means that if they did lie, it could be 90%. I mean, so that's kind of what we're looking at. We're not looking at these really low levels of social desirability. They're being honest with us about what their practices are, and that's refreshing, and it gives us good read.
And that, I mean, it sounds like that then helps with the concept that you and David built around this idea of digital Babylon, because you're getting a very clear idea of the landscape that's there. I would love to dive into some of what you found, because in the midst of what you're finding, you're getting true responses, which then also leads to these 5 things that you found. And I'm excited to be able to dive into it, because I think that they're really helpful. Yeah, Walt.
Yeah, before we do that, I want to ask you a question just to get some clarification here, because this is sparking some thoughts in my mind, and let me see if I can verbalize this. This is always the problem, right? Getting it from your head to your lips in a comprehensible way. Yeah. So Mark, when you talk about this shift in honesty, I had this conversation with someone where, kids, let's say 30, 40 years ago, kids 30, 40 years ago may have been sexually active, but they knew they shouldn't have been. Evangelical Christian kids, which is, by and large what you're looking at here. So they would have that sense of, there'd be a commonly held sense of morality, and they were straying outside of that, and they were aware that I was stepping outside of the bounds of what is right, at least as it's stated by the church or what they had learned. Would some of this slide now just as a result of living in digital Babylon, A, and B, maybe our failures in the church and in youth ministry? We can be critical about this because we're all a part of this. I mean, I've had to repent of many things I did and didn't do in youth ministry. But could part of this be that we just haven't done a good job, and we haven't talked about a faith that's integrated in all of life? So our kids now, they just accept in this more amoral world, this is just the way it is. This is the way life is. They don't have that standard, that commonly held standard of morality to look back at. Let's see what kind of job I just did bringing that from my brain to my lips. But
yeah,
I'm
so if I
thinking
hear
out loud, yeah.
if I hear what you're saying is that people knew there was a moral line and that they were stepping outside of it, and today those moral lines don't really exist, so there's no concern about that in sharing that.
Yes,
yeah,
and,
I would say
and,
that's true.
yeah, and I was going to say in the church. I mean, has that happened partially or maybe in large part because we've been maybe doing the wrong things or shooting at the wrong things or employing the wrong methods or not, doing youth ministry in a complete way, an integrated way as we should. I'm just wondering if it's kind of cause and effect.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, Walt, and I don't know that I could answer it, but I do think that we've, for a long time, we haven't always known why something worked. I've been a part of taking over a few legacy organizations that were already existing and had been successful at one time, were trailing, and then I came into leadership to try and help maybe revive it or keep it alive or figure out how to size it to continue so that it had sustainability. And what I found in interviewing earlier leaders is that the things that they thought made them successful weren't always the real factors of why they were successful. They just were, and they didn't really know why. And I think that sometimes in youth ministry, we had maybe the wrong indicators of success. So we thought we were successful because we were measuring ourselves according to faulty standards, but we didn't really know why people were showing up and coming. We thought it was really because we had good programs. And then all of a sudden you get put up against another option and you find out it really wasn't our program that was so successful. It just was the only option. And so now when there is something to compete against it, kids are making a value judgment as to whether or not they participate or not. Oh, so it wasn't that I was really transforming lives and creating value. It was just that it was the only option that they had. And now they've got another option. They're making a value judgment and finding that we're not succeeding. So I think we've incorrectly sometimes evaluated what was working and without really trying to understand what was working or what needed to work. And we kind of operated out of ignorance. And, in Good to Great, they talk about the spiral of doom, the doom loop is what he calls it, Jim Collins. And it's basically having actions without understanding. And so when you get disappointing results, you take action without understanding why you have those disappointing results, and that leads to more disappointing results, and it leads to more action without understanding until you literally spiral down. And I've seen that happen in a lot of youth ministry. They don't really take the time to fully understand, why is this broken? Why is this not working? We're just not getting the results we want. We're not getting the numbers that we want. But they may not be asking the question, are we getting the transformation that we want? And so they react. We need to, have more free pizza. And so they do an action without really understanding. And then it only cheapens what they're doing. And so they get more disappointing results. People go, this is lame. And then they try to, and so it starts this cycle downward, and then pretty soon you have nothing to work with anymore. So I think that's maybe contributing. I'm riffing here off my my experiences in the past, but that's kind of why insight and data is so important. People often say, what's the value of this? What do I practically do? And by the way, I think of all the things that David and I have been involved in research-wise, this may be one of the most practical
absolutely
projects that we've done. But that was because, and this is why David invited me into the conceiving of this project, because as somebody who's consumed his data and put it into action in the past, he wanted to try to figure out how to do that in this book as we were putting it together. And so that was a big part, is how do we take these insights and turn them into actionable, tangible, kind of practical things we can do.
Right, and the result then is what you talked about, what you alluded to there, which we're going to talk about after the break, and that is, how can our youth ministries be transformative? Because actually that's what discipleship, Christian formation, spiritual nurture is all about. So stick with us. We'll come back. Jason and I are talking to our friend Mark Matlock about the new book, Faith for Exiles, that he's written with David Kinnaman. We'll be right back. Since we're talking today about David Kinnaman and Mark Matlock's great new book, Faith for Exiles, I want to invite you to join with a group of youth workers, parents, and pastors who will be reading and discussing Faith for Exiles together during January and February of 2020. Currently, over 500 people are part of a private Facebook group that reads and discusses significant books together. If you'd like to learn more, log on to Facebook and look for the CPYU Reading Discussion Group. Ask to join the group and we'll let you in. The group will be working through Faith for Exiles with a scheduled reading plan during January and February, and you can add to the discussion as little or as much as you'd like. It's a great way to read and learn together.
Welcome back to Youth Culture Matters. Having a great conversation on a new book that was just recently released with our guest, Mark Matlock, who co-wrote Faith for Exiles, 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. And right before the end of the break, we were discussing how can youth ministry become transformative. Before we dive into some of the 5 practical aspects that you described within the book, I do want to hit upon the frame, the word exiles. And you talked about 4 different kind of exiles in your book. Could you highlight some of those before we dive into the 5 practical ways?
Yeah, so this whole idea of living in exile, which is, to be honest, I believe the New Testament model for how Christians should be living constantly, right? Once we put our trust in Jesus for our sins, when that happens and we are renewed, our citizenship changes. We no longer belong to this world, to any nation, any community, any neighborhood. As a citizen, we're a resident alien, and we participate with our presence, but we're representing a foreign country, the kingdom of heaven, and we're ambassadors for Jesus Christ. So, in a sense, when we look at the exiles in the Old Testament, when we look at Esther, when we look at Daniel, when we look at Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when we look at Joseph in Egypt, they were living in exile, and they were representing their people, and they were representing the people of God in those contexts. And they were being used by God to represent him in those contexts. So what we realize is that the church is living in a form of exile right now. We are resident aliens in a foreign land, and that land we call Digital Babylon in the book. And one of the brilliant things that David did in You Lost Me was really trying to figure out the profiles of those that were leaving the church, because it was really easy to say, all these people are walking away from Jesus, or these people are walking away from the church, and really trying to understand what was going on there with those that were walking away. We kind of wanted to do a little bit more detail work, some things that we didn't think about until after You Lost Me came out. So we went and looked in, and what we did is we came up with 4 different profiles that we found most 18 to 29-year-olds fit into, that had considered themselves to be a Christian at some point in time in their life. So this makes up about 83% of that population. Just to get an idea of who considered themselves to be a Christian at some point in time in their life. That'd be about 83%. So that's just an important number to kind of have in your mind. So there's 17% of the population that were of a distinctly other faith, or said, I've never considered myself to be a Christian. I've been an atheist my entire existence. Now, from that group, we have the group that we call prodigals. Those are people who at one time in their life considered themselves to be a Christian and no longer do. That number is 22%. That's roughly makes up that size of the population. Now, when we did this and asked the same questions 7 years ago for You Lost Me, That number was 11%. So in less than a decade, we've seen almost a doubling of those who no longer identify with Christianity. That is significant trend, and it's consistent with things that we're seeing from other research projects and studies in terms of these trends on the nones. Then there's the nomads. The nomads are the unchurched, those that have said, I still consider myself to be a Christian, but I don't go to church with any kind of regularity. So they're not really connected to a faith community. Now, we could easily say these people literally have their hand on the door of Christianity, but for whatever reason, they still identify as a Christian. They're just not really connected to a community of faith. And that size of that population is about 30% of those 18 to 29-year-olds. And then we have a group called the habituals. And this is a really interesting group. And this is really, to be honest, to me, this is the good news story. This is the actionable story of these four groups. They make up 38% of the 18 to 29-year-olds who consider themselves to be Christians. They identify as being a Christian. They attend church with a certain frequency. However, when we ask them questions about how central their faith was to their life, or ask them questions about how confident they were in the scriptures to lead them, ask them questions fleshing out their identity of Jesus Christ, we would not say that those fit probably would consider an orthodox view of the Word of God and the nature of Jesus Christ. Nor would they say that it's central to their faith, which may be more of an evangelical kind of question, but we asked that question. So that made up 38%.
Could I, before you get to that fourth group, just to clarify with them, could you give an example of maybe something that they would say that was off from traditional Orthodox belief?
Yeah, like they would just basically say, I don't believe that the Bible is, the infallible Word of God, something of that nature. They would say, I don't believe that Jesus was actually the Son of God who died on the cross for my sin, that kind of a thing. So they would not show strength of conviction in those areas. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Thanks. Mm-hmm.
And so these are people that may be young Christians that have just come into the faith, but probably just based on what we know about this group, they are probably people that are growing up in the church and have not yet really had an encounter with Jesus and have not really come to a full understanding of the Christian faith. And so it's 38% of this population. This group is showing up to church, though, frequently. So they are a group that we should be really interested in connecting with. And one of the things that I've realized in youth ministry over the last 20 years, I make a lot of wrong assumptions about what I visually see kids doing, showing up, raising their hands in worship, being willing to go and serve on a mission trip. Until I really sit down and ask them, what do you believe? What do you think about things? How do you make decisions in your life? And how does faith inform those decisions that you make? That's really where I start to find out what their faith profile is. And a lot of times we look at a large group of kids in the room raising their hands, worshiping with their eyes closed, maybe even crying. And we go, man, they're being moved by the Holy Spirit. And the reality is we don't know what's going on there. And so I've learned in youth ministry, I can't make assumptions about what's going on the inside unless I sit down and have a conversation with them and we really get to know each other and we do some life together.
Yeah.
And
that just to stop there, that's brilliant what you just said. And that's a big issue that I'm really concerned about because, I feel like those are wrong markers, right? Those are the wrong markers, but we have been in our youth ministry world lulled into thinking that those are the markers.
To be honest, we've just never thought about it.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, they've never thought, we do this, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but we actually do a exercise when I go in and actually coach leadership teams through this book so that they can come up with actionable plans for their church based on the insights that are context relevant to them as a church. So we do some facilitation things. And one of the exercises is we try to help the church identify what their vision of a disciple is and what those components are. And most churches say, wow, we've never talked about this. We don't know what a definition is. You can't become what you can't define. Yeah. And so if as leaders, we don't know, we'll say, hey, I just want people to follow Jesus, or I want people to be more like Jesus. What does that look like? And what are you actually, and it's amazing how many churches are like going, wow, we've never had this conversation as a team. And so we have to ask ourselves, what are the real markers? What is it that we're looking for? And when you start to articulate it, you realize, wow, I've really maybe not thought about this like I probably should have.
Yeah, something you just said there that really resonates with me is where you talk about, we don't know, we say we want people to follow Jesus, but I'm hearing, and we can't define that, but I'm hearing people even moving more backwards in their desires for their ministries, where they'll say, all I want to do is see kids come to Jesus, which is markedly different from following Jesus, because then we interpret it as, the raised hand, the step forward, the yes, the yes to an invitation, and what happens after that. And that's where, when I was reading your book, I'm going, man, these suggestions are awesome.
Yeah, well, the invitation, that's the first part. The first point of contact Jesus had with everybody was the invitation. Mm-hmm. The real work was what happened after. And that's what we have to figure out, is where's the real work of what we're doing, and do we understand what we're even trying to do? I think, when I was leading YS, we did a bunch of what I would call we called them pop-up conferences. They're improvisational conferences. We call them unconferences, youth ministry unconferences, and or YS listens. And basically, we woke up in the morning and people showed up in a room, and we made an agenda, and we had conversations all day around the things people wanted to talk about. It was really cool. But one of the things that I took away, having done, over a dozen of these in a very short period of time all across the country, was how much most youth ministers would verbalize, I really don't know what I'm doing right now, or I don't know if what I'm doing is working. And I realized we don't really have many models for what we're doing. Everybody kind of got away from the model thing, feeling like it was a formula. But what those models were at least some kind of framework or benchmarks to understand, what is my theory of change? How do I believe this actually happens? You can do that narratively. You can do that with a triangle. You can do that with a three-dimensional cube. I don't care how you define it. But we have to have some sense of what our theory of change is, in what we're doing in ministry, and ask ourselves, is that good enough? Is that a good enough theory of change?
Yeah. Hey, hit that fourth group.
Yeah. So the fourth group make up 10% of the 18 to 29-year-olds that identified as a Christian, and they're what we would call resilient disciples. They go to church with about the same frequency as the habituals, but they also do something with the church besides Sunday. So they're kind of doing worship service plus. So there's some other program that they're participating in outside of just the regular Sunday. They also would say that faith is central to their life. They believe that their purpose on earth is to have their faith impact the world around them. So this isn't a consumer mentality toward Christianity, but this idea that my faith changes me so that I can make a difference in the world. And then they answer those doctrinal questions are kind of squarely in what we consider orthodox Christianity. So those are what made up that result. And it's, this book's supposed to be about the hopeful good news part of this research, but let's face it, we're saying that 1 out of every 10 people who identify as a Christian between the ages of 18 and 29-year-olds are actually living a vibrant faith, is kind of what you could look at and say that. It's hard to totally go in and look at that 38% that's of the habituals. It looks like they're going to church more out of tradition than a connection to Jesus, based on some other profiling that we'll talk about with these 5 practices. But they're it is a bad news story, but there's also some things that we learned about that group that I think become the levers by which we can start building ministry that really connects and builds disciples. And let's face it, theologically, we know that God has typically used a remnant to accomplish his purposes. So we don't need to be completely discouraged that maybe there's only a small number of these disciples. There's a lot of mystery around how those numbers form and whose responsibility it is for those numbers. But what we can learn about that group and how to nourish and strengthen them should give us a lot of insight for how we're designing our ministry.
Would it be fair to say then, with that fourth group, the resilient group, which we'll dive into the 5 practicalities that you found, that if we really follow what was done with resilient exiles, there's an opportunity for us to reach that 38%, the habitual churchgoers, that there's absolutely an opportunity to be able to engage this group that could change that number from 1 to 10 to 1 out of every 2 or close to, that if some of these things are really engaged and we start asking a different question around something like youth ministry or just church in general.
Yeah, I think that's my hope. Once again, all of these things are correlation. They're not necessarily causation. So, this is something that has to be proved out in practice. But, every research project has its limitations and weaknesses. Ours does too. But when you look at these profiling questions and you compare the different categories, it is remarkable. It's in almost every question that we ask about the church they grew up in, their experience and family, there's a double-digit gap between the resilience and the habituals, and then another gap between the habituals and the nomads. The nomads and the prodigals almost are within just a handful of like 1 or 2 percentage points away from each other in terms of how they respond to most things. So there really is an opportunity with this habitual group. I think in the past, we've always said, how do we keep these kids that are walking away in the church? What we need to be concerned about is how do we keep the kids that are coming to church from becoming that nomad group that walks away from the church. And I think these 5 practices can help us.
Gosh, that's great. Okay, so we've brought that up. We are going to do some conversation around those 5, and we'll do that right after this break, so stay with us.
Are you interested in bringing CPYU to your church, school, or community? A big part of our ministry is the on-site seminars we conduct in dozens of settings every year. CPYU seminars are designed to encourage and educate your audience on a variety of youth culture issues. Every seminar is designed to be informative, practical, and hope-filled. If you want to learn more about our CPYU seminars, available speakers, and the many seminar topics and options in our growing seminar lineup, go to our CPYU homepage at cpyu.org. Click on the seminar option on the menu bar at the top of the page, and you can learn more about how to schedule a CPYU speaker and seminar for your parents, youth workers, and educators. What a great conversation we're having with Mark Matlock about the book he's written with David Kinnaman, brand new, Faith for Exiles, 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. And I'm going to say it again, this book, and I was on an airplane reading it, and when I landed, I texted David, I texted Mark, and I said, my heart is leaping as I read this. This is, without a doubt, the best, I will say, youth ministry book that I've read in the last 5 years. And I really believe in this, and that's one reason why we've got Mark on the podcast here. I mean, well, we have numerous reasons. Mark's a great guy, but for this one, this book is just incredible, and I would really encourage a church staff to hunker down and read it, a youth ministry staff to hunker down and read it. Parents, you need to read this. And it's not so much about, I think, where, kids are and maybe where kids have gone wrong, but I read this and I'm thinking, This is my world. This is my tribe, the youth ministry tribe, and this is where we haven't really done a good job. I think we've lost our sense of what Jesus has called us to be and called us to do in the lives of kids. And again, the reason my heart was leaping was just from the standpoint of theology, I'm reading this and going, yes, yes, yes. What the research is showing is exactly what the scriptures call us to. I want to mention real quick that if you're listening to this, just track with our social media at CPYU. We've got a Facebook community. We've got Twitter. There's other ways to track with us at cpyu.org. And once this podcast launches, Mark and David were kind enough to send us 5 copies of the book. We're going to give those away. We'll let you know on social media how that's going to happen. So track with us on that. You've got a chance to win a copy of Faith for Exiles. Mark, jump into the practical side now. Let's walk through the 5 practices that are present in the lives of these resilients, and just a little bit of suggestions on each. I mean, people need to get the book to really unpack this and start to think about it.
This overview. In fact, it's been hard because when I just give the overview of the 5, a lot of pastors, not so much youth pastors, but pastors will say, "Oh, we do that."
Yeah,
and it's like, I think you need to listen to what we're talking about, and maybe you are doing it, but like Paul wrote to the church of Thessalonica, you guys are loving each other, you're serving each other, and I want you to do that more and more. And I think that's the thing, is we might be doing some of these things, but we might not be doing them as well as we could. And so we really need to be honest with ourselves, and that's I think one of the harder things to do sometimes in ministry. So the first practice is seems kind of obvious, but it's experiencing Jesus, an experience of Jesus. And one of the things that we've found about these resilients is that they're able to kind of clear the religious clutter away from their lives, so they really have a relationship with Christ. When we look at the age that most of these resilients came to faith, it was 2 or 3 years older on average than the other groups. So that is an interesting insight, because it may be that these students had time to really understand who Jesus was and what it meant to follow him. And that's why they have this relationship with him. Just an interesting side note. One of the things that when we ask a series of profiling questions about just how they relate to Jesus, talk to Jesus, while 100% of resilients, habituals, and nomads still identify as Christians, there was real big difference in terms of how they describe their relationship to Christ, like night and day. And so it's one thing to say, have people really put their trust in Jesus, or have they been socialized to the church and Christianity? And that's one of the things that we really have to look at in how we're raising disciples. I know for myself, with my 2 children that are now in their 20s, I was very mindful of this, because I saw in our research, even when they were younger, just the trend lines of this, and wanted them to be able to have their own faith journey. And so I really tried to protect them from being socialized to Christianity. And that's presented a little bit of a different faith trajectory than some of their friends. But it's been interesting to see, as time's gone on, how their experience with faith is different, and their relationship with Jesus is different over time. And how their understanding of grace is different over time compared to the kind of, especially we live in Texas, it's the Bible Belt here. Going to church, everybody does it. So that's been kind of interesting. But we have to really focus on that. Anything you want to say about that before I move on to number 2?
No, keep going. Well, you know what? No, you gave me an opening there. I'm going to take it real quick. I love. No, seriously, you're making me think. And the book made me think.
Note to self. Don't give Walt an
Don't do
opening.
that again. You should have learned that a long time ago, Mark, in your interactions with me. But so like I'll see like a Facebook post in one of the youth ministry forums, let's say, which are very active. And I track with most of them, but I'll say, hey, somebody will post, hey, we had camp last week, or we were at the such and such concert, and I had 100 kids become followers of Jesus. Uh, and basically what we're talking about there is like it's an indication of raising a hand or going forward whenever an invitation was given. I always feel like, those are great things to rejoice about, but I think we rejoice too soon about something that's not totally complete. And I like what you said about that 3-year gap, because one of the ideas I've been trying to promote to youth workers is when you issue an invitation, and they look at me like I'm crazy when I say this, but when you issue a quote-unquote invitation, invite them to come walk with you for 9 months to a year to learn what it means to follow Jesus and then make a decision, as opposed to, raise your hand now and boom, you're in. I don't know. You can react to that, but that's what came to mind as you were talking about those differences there.
Well, I think what you're highlighting, Walt, is, and that's a very interesting idea that you're proposing there. But my experience, and I've never been on staff.
I noticed
at a
you
church.
Didn't say it was a good idea. You said it was very interesting.
Well, it is, because I have to think about it. To be honest, I think functionally that's what happens, right? Is, kids raise their hand and then, you start trying to help them follow Christ, and it either proves that truly was a moment of transformation, and they're able to build off of it, or they kind of fall away, and we've all seen that. I think what we can't. So I was a volunteer in youth ministry for like almost 2 decades at my church. Making disciples is hard. It is hard. It is painful. And unfortunately, one of my big concerns, especially as leading YS, was, are we trying to make youth ministry too easy to do? And you mentioned some of the forums and the bulletin boards, and when I can throw out, and I think it's great that we can reach out and say, hey, anybody got some ideas for this? Anybody got some help for this? There are times when we need help. Every time we finish a program, we got usually less than 7 days staring us in the face before we have to do that again. It's a grind, right? Unlike Saturday Night Live that can take several weekends off and roll repeat tapes, we can't do that. We have to have a live thing every single time, and we're expected to deliver on it. It's pressure, so it's great that we have that. The problem is I can get real lazy with the resources. Rather than seeing those things as freeing up my time so that I can do the hard work of discipleship, which when I imagine, Mike Yaconelli and Wayne Rice starting an organization like Youth Specialties, are going, hey, if we share all the ideas that we have, that means we're spending less time coming up with games and icebreakers, and we're spending more time forging disciples. I'd like to believe that's what they were thinking when they started creating all these resources. But what's happened is that the resources have become what youth ministry is. And so we think that this is what youth ministry is, are the icebreakers and the games and the fun things that make us look like heroes, and not the hard work of discipleship. And so we start leaning into these resources to do the harder work. And I've often wondered if it's made us lazy in some ways when it comes to forging disciples, because it is brutal. It is brutal. There's a reason Jesus only took on 12.
Well, before you move on to the second one, I do want to point out something that you actually wrote in the book, and it's just that the church is one of the least demanding environments for young people in terms of what they are asked to do mentally and emotionally, and what is expected of them when it comes to serving and giving. We're just so happy to have them there. Yet one of the most helpful or hopeful findings in our research is this: young, exemplar Christians are more willing to be challenged than the church is willing to challenge them. And I think that this is just sums up what has been said and what you're saying, and I just absolutely applaud that. And also, it's a good reminder. It's a really good reminder.
So when we did this initial survey, it actually came to me in binders on teens and evangelism. One of the things that we found when we surveyed non-Christian teenagers about programs they would like to come to in a church, most non-Christian teenagers were less interested in programs that were like entertainment based in terms of whether they would come or not. They were more interested in things like serving the community, all of these things that were actually like work oriented. And I was like, there's a sense of productivity, of making things, of bettering the world around me that calls out to a part of me, part of the image of God that's broken inside of me, that's saying, I want to make the world a better place. The church, could you give me an opportunity? And yet at the time, a lot of churches said, well, if you want to serve in our missions trip or our service project, you got to do all these really religious things before we're going to let you do that. Rather than seeing that that is actually a way that people connect with who being the hands and feet of Jesus and identify with the gospel. They go, I want to make that bigger in me. This part of me that's seeing the community transformed and people's lives such, I want to do that more and more. Guess what? You can't do that unless Jesus is the Lord of your life, unless you are restored and filled with the Holy Spirit. Then you have these incredible resources available to you to be able to do that. So this experience of Jesus is a really important piece. But yeah, I think that young people are wanting to do harder things than we want. Once again, that's a action without understanding kind of thing.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Hey,
harder does not mean boring. By the way, sometimes people go, hey, we get really into theology and church history. We're looking for those Marines for God. And it's like, you know what? As long as it's interesting and engaging, but, harder does not mean boring. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who did all this research on flow, which is the zone of optimal performance, which that time when you're working and you lose sense of time and space, you look up and you go, oh my gosh, it's already 3 a.m. How did the time fly? That means that you were doing an activity that was challenging, but within your reach to accomplish. And gaming has figured out how to leverage this. Something that's just hard enough that it's challenging, but achievable with enough effort that it keeps you don't get frustrated with it. And this zone, and I believe that eternity is flow. I believe that the work that God created us to do in eternity is that work that's challenging but within our reach. And so we lose sense of time and space, and we actually enter into eternity. So that's a little out there, I know, but it's important to one of our other points that I'll bring up in a moment on vocational discipleship.
Yeah. Hey, I want to honor your time, and I want to honor Jason's time. Jason, you might have to check out to take a kid to school, I guess, but I think is that accurate?
Yes, that's
okay.
accurate.
Right. See, I just want to let people in on the humanness of this, that we actually do. We have a flow here. It's kind of an eternal podcast, but if you would, Mark, maybe just a flyover of the last 4 couple minutes each, because I know people are going. Yeah.
Yeah. So the second thing is meaningful relationships. Now, once again, it's real easy to say. Our church does that. We give people an opportunity to have community, and a lot of churches like to pride themselves on their community. However, when we look at resilient disciples and we look at habituals, there's a huge difference in terms of how they're experiencing community at church and intergenerationally. Yeah. And that it was a very powerful insight. Resilient disciples don't just have relationships across generations, but they are around other Christians that they want to become. And that is a powerful insight. And it's different between us. So if you tell me that your church is doing that, we've got young people here and they're in community, I can say, well, I can tell you that probably a good chunk of those are not experiencing what you think they're experiencing based on our research. A small group might be catching some of that, and it might be happening for other reasons that you're not intentionally designing or allowing for. But the majority of them are not experiencing that based on what we found there. Cultural discernment, being able to literally apply the Word of God to life situations that they're encountering in culture. Resilience, know how to integrate the Bible and faith. They understand the tension of those things, and they know where to go if they don't know the answers. And that's just sometimes as important as knowing what to do, knowing who to go to for help, especially when you're younger. So cultural discernment is a real important piece. And then fourth is vocational discipleship. This is one, every church that I've worked with in applying these, when they evaluate how they're doing with all 5 of these practices, vocational discipleship is almost crickets. we are not helping young people navigate their careers and their vocation and their calling. It's not, and when I say calling, that is not a call to ministry. That is a call to a life of integrated faith and work, whatever that is. And to me, one of the greatest things a youth pastor could do is learn how to be a vocational coach. You will become so much more valuable. In fact, I was actually, as I was departing YS in my leadership, that was a big initiative that I was getting ready to roll out, was this thing. It was called Project Bowstring. And it was all about faith and work. And we were wanting to try and help youth pastors bridge that gap to being vocational coaches, because that doesn't just provide value to the people in your church, but your community as well. You can now be valuable to any family that has a young person in helping them navigate their future. And let's face it, as ministers, we often think the best thing to do is to get them to be missionaries or pastors or whatever. But as we go into digital Babylon, being workplace people of faith is probably going to have the greater influence on culture, society, and reaching the lost. So vocational discipleship is a key component to this. And we saw that Resilience knew how to do that.
Well, I'm just going to throw something in here, because as you're saying this, and even as I read this, we dropped a podcast. One of the last episodes we put up was with Luke Bobo, who runs the Made to Flourish. And he's got a new book out. Jason, what's the title of the book? You had it there in your hand.
Fertile Ground: Faith and Work for Youth Pastors.
Yeah, it's a field guide. And what he does is he actually says, he gives youth workers, here are 5 skills you need to develop. And he actually there were a series of writers who wrote these. He edited the book, but 5 skills, and one of those was to actually be like a guidance counselor, to develop that skill to do exactly what you're talking about here, Mark. Yeah. So to see how your research has meshed with theirs is it's just brilliant. Yeah, totally. And again, that's like chill-inducing for me.
Yeah, that's the Made to Flourish that's kind of happening out of Notre Dame, right?
Well, they're actually in Kansas City, correct? Is that right? Is that where they came from, Chris? Kansas City? Yeah. So yeah, Luke came from Kansas City, but they're doing great work there as an organization.
There's another Made to Flourish group out of Notre Dame that's doing some incredible research on work and faith. So, well, anyway, but I am familiar with that work there, and yes, we need to be leaning into that. Then the last thing is just living on countercultural mission. We have to be demonstrating that when we live counterculturally, it actually makes Jesus known in a more powerful way. This is what Esther did. This is what Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. They knew that by living counter to the culture, by trusting in God, there were demonstrably powerful ways that God was made known in living that way. And that's what we've seen with the Resilient Disciples. They have found that not only does living on mission, is it a better life, but it's a life that's really bearing fruit out in the world around them. I was at Rift Valley Academy speaking to a group of missionary kids at their Spiritual Emphasis Week and expat kids. And I was talking to a group, and they said to me, I said, what's the challenge of living? Literally, you're living on a campus that is surrounded by a wall. What's the challenge of living out your faith here? And one of these kids said, sometimes it's hard to be a candle in a well-lit room. And that was one of the more profound things I've ever heard said to describe sometimes how we allow kids to experience their faith. Is that they're around so much light, they can't see the light of God in them and how effective it is. They just take that light for granted. My daughter, as she's moved to New York City to go to school and is living in Manhattan, her faith has really been enhanced, and our conversations have been enriched, leaving the Bible Belt, because she's seeing how the light really illuminates darkness. And she's seeing that contrast in a way that she had never seen it before. And so to build resilient disciples, We have to be giving them opportunities where they can really see that the light makes a difference. And sometimes we don't really put them in those countercultural moments and situations and challenge them to really lean into the ways of Christ in a way that manifests themselves.
Yeah. Mark, what are some, just off the top of your head real quickly, what are some quote-unquote playgrounds where our kids are living and living out their lives where that should be happening and youth workers should be guiding them into that?
Well, I would even say things, some of it is actually getting out into the community, not into safe spaces, but into unsafe spaces, and really, doing that, being salt and light in those locations. And those are things about, just where you're doing your service and all that. But the other part of it is framing, right? Nobody ever frames purity as it's always about don't get STDs, honor God with your body, all this stuff. But it's never, when you do this, you are setting yourself apart for God to work in some really amazing and powerful ways, living counter to the culture. This is missional living. This isn't just about we want you to not have sex. This is about literally displaying your trust in God, that I trust God for something better in my life. That's what I'm holding out for, is this better thing. Abstention is not about restriction and not doing something that everybody else is doing. It's about a powerful way of showing my trust in God that engages the culture around me. And so I think there's something really, really powerful about how we frame living in a countercultural way. When Samuel said, I'm not going to eat the food from your table, Nebuchadnezzar, it wasn't just a ritual or a law that he didn't want to break. It was, I trust in God's word so much that I need to stand up and set myself apart for something good. And God blessed that. And the king saw it, and it led him to show favor to them. And so if we want to, to see these same things happen so that the world can know who God is, that's why we're living this way. It's not because of some rule set we need to follow, or in the end, it's really good for me. It's really about I'm manifesting the very presence of God through the life that I'm living.
This is so good. So good. We've come to the end of our time. I don't know, Jason, any final word from you?
No, that last part preached.
Yeah,
so
I can see you getting excited there. That's
it.
great. Yeah. And these are the things we talk about, Jason, at Project 619 with our Sexual Integrity Initiative here at CPYU and everything else. And again, this is youth workers, you have to read this book. Mark, I love talking to you. I was thinking about the first time I think you and I had a conversation. It was either in a little Mexican restaurant out in, remember that crew that was together out in Malibu, or where were we that time? And then we were sitting by the water. I'm appalled you can't remember this. You're just looking at me with a blank look on your face, which is great. But we had a great conversation. All that to say,
I'm just trying to figure out how you texted me, how you had my cell number. I can't figure that out.
What are you talking
no,
about?
I'm kidding.
Hey, but here's the thing. Here's what I want to say. Every time,
we've had lots of conversations.
I know. But I remember the first one. I thought, I am loving this. And every time I talk to you, this is not to flatter you, but every time I talk to you, I realize why I enjoy talking to you. And I as these things have developed in you, and you've devoted yourself to making us better, and ultimately to serve the King and the kingdom and our kids and our families, I'm very appreciative of that. And David as well. I'm sorry he couldn't join us today, but this book that they've written, again, Faith for Exiles, 5 Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon, is a great one. So, Mark,
Walt,
thank you.
Could I put one other thought in?
Yeah.
So think about Esther, who was living in her exile moment. Think about what Mordecai said to her. He said, you know what? God is going to protect and save his people, right? He's sovereign. He's made promises. He's not going to break them. And we know that is true. But Mordecai challenges Esther and says, for such a time as this, perhaps you are here in this place to be used by God. And he's like, God's going to do what he's going to do. He doesn't need us, but this is an opportunity to be his instrument. And I would say, as youth ministers, this is our Mordecai moment right now, at this point in time in history, to challenge these resilience and say, for such a time as this, right? You have been placed here by God, and we need to be leaning into these resilience and into their imagination and into who they are. They will reach more of their generation if we help them understand the time that they're living in and how God wants to display himself through them, much more than we ever will as the youth pastor or youth worker. We need to be the facilitator of that, the wise person who can go in and help in the maturation process. But God wants to use this generation, and this is our Mordecai moment as ministers.
Thanks so much. And, again, I'll just throw something else on. I'm heaping this praise on you. Thank you for modeling for us how to go to the Scriptures as well. I really appreciate that. Well, thanks, folks, for joining us. Again, if you like what you're hearing here, you need to get this book, Faith for Exiles. Again, track with us on social media. You'll have a chance to win a copy. Mark and David have given us 5 copies that we'll be giving away. And tell others about the podcast. If you would, subscribe. You can subscribe to Youth Culture Matters wherever you get your podcasts. And we remind you as well, our other little daily 1-minute podcast, Youth Culture Today, do the same there. So until the next time we're together, thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Youth Culture Matters.
Thanks for joining us for Youth Culture Matters, a podcast from the Center for Parent-Youth Understanding. If you'd like to learn more about today's youth culture, visit our website at cpyu.org. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, email us at podcast@cpyu.org.